So this day 3 of the State We're In, Democracies, Fractures, Fixes and Futures conference. We've had a great time so far. I'm very enthused. I'm looking forward to the presentations again today, as well as I think you are as well. And I hope nobody's suffering from conference fatigue yet, because we've still got a whole day coming up tomorrow as well. It is my duty now just to introduce the Dean of our Humanities faculty at Nelson Mandela University, who is also a co-convener of this conference, Pamela Maseko, Prof. Pamela Maseko, to just say a few welcoming words before we get the session started. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you. Thanks, Gio. Let me first acknowledge the Deputy Vice-Chancellors who may be here, particularly Professor Andre Piet, the Director of the Center for Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, Mr. Alan Zen, all our guests and conference participants. Greetings, Ndiabulisa in my language. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the third day of the stage you are in, Democracies, Fractures, Fixes and Futures International Conference at our University, Nelson Mandela in Gqeberha. Let me extend a special welcome to the keynote speaker for today, Professor Karen Mao, who will be speaking later in the afternoon, and to the presenters in today's plenary, the symposium, and the various panels. The program for today features speakers from universities in Brazil, Ethiopia, India, the United States of America, and South Africa. I'm particularly fascinated with the diversity of the presenters, especially in relation to countries of origin, and as with the previous 2 days, we're looking forward to intellectually engaging in deep conversations on the themes as featured in the programs. Issues of accountability of the state organs, public policy and governance, social justice, and inclusion in institutions of power, Black political thought, for example, remain critical globally as we engage with questions on how to advance democracy in local, continental, and other contexts. The speakers in the program today are uniquely placed to debate these and highlight key themes and trends for us as the audience. I must acknowledge Professor Christy van der Westhuizen and the rest of the conference organizing committee for putting together incredible speakers and engaging program, and for the prominence of the voice from the Global South, not only in today's sessions, but in the entire conference program. This is particularly important for us as the Faculty of Humanities at Nelson Mandela University, as we drive our academic projects centered around the revitalization of the humanities and the significance of Africa as a source from which we start the reimagination and reinvigoration of the humanities and social sciences scholarship in the academy. We are incredibly fortunate in the faculty that this is also one of the institutional strategic focus areas as articulated by the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sibongile Mutwa, in her opening address at the start of the conference. We come from a period in our country, and in fact throughout the world, where the shortage of skills in science, technology, engineering, and math subjects meant that national resources were directed towards these subjects, with the results that focus shifted away from the humanities and social sciences disciplines and led to what others referred to as intellectual stagnation of the disciplines. The reimagination of the humanities in a way that engages with what it means to be human and how to cultivate humanity, as expressed by our Vice-Chancellor in her inaugural address in 2018, has required that we draw deep in the traditional value of these disciplines in getting society to think, engage critically about the value of humanities in understanding and interpreting human behavior around social experiences. It has also required that as we engage as a faculty in the project of the revitalization of the humanities, we think again deeply about the nature of knowledge we produce. And of equal importance in this process is how we value Africa's participation. It is becoming urgent now, more than ever before, for Africa not only to contest hegemonies, especially dominant hegemonies in knowledge production, but to start constructing value and authority of knowledge derived from Africa in terms of both location and experience. Our scholarship was shared yesterday and will be presented here today as well. This scholarship, driven from our academic schools and research chairs and centers. Let me start with the research chairs. The first one is Identities and Social Cohesion in Africa, and Ocean Cultures and Heritage, and African Feminist Imaginations. And the research centers on African philosophy, gender and women's studies, and the Raymond Mhlaba Center on Governance, Leadership, and Public Policy. Some of our research focus areas are on the culture and heritage, African intellectual histories, with a focus on women, governance and policy, and the digital humanities. Also featured our collaborations with local universities. Also featuring our collaborations with local universities have been shared in this conference. Yesterday, our colleagues from the faculty presented a symposium coordinated by Dr. Babalwa Makokwana from the Center for Gender and Women's Studies. And the symposium was titled African Feminism in Post-Colony, as you would know. Today, I wish to highlight the work from the School of Governmental and Social Sciences, Department of History and Political Studies, in featuring Dr. Ntsikelelo Breakfast, Professor Njongwana, and Mr. Ongama Mdimka, as well as colleagues from Ambo University in Ethiopia and St. Louis University in the USA. I trust that the engagement that ensue from today's session let me repeat that. I trust that engagement that ensue from today's sessions refine our intellectual project as the humanities faculty and as humanities and social sciences scholars across the globe. Let me end off my address by acknowledging once again Professor Christie van der Westhuizen and the rest of the conference organizing committee for the work that went into getting together such great scholars. I also want to acknowledge the great intellectual partnership of our faculty has with the Center for Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy and the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation, who together have brought us as the faculty as co-hosts of this conference. So thank you, Mr. Alan Zeal and Professor Andre Kiet Nangamso. I sincerely hope you will enjoy today's debates and networking and whatever is possible through this virtual platform. Thank you very much, Makwande and Nangamso. And we say those two phrases in the faculty as we invoke growth and depth of partnerships and sustainability of collaborations started here. Ndiyabulela.
Thank you, Prof. Maseko, for that warm welcome to day 3. I must say the 3 things that you said there that really stood out for me, thinking about cultivating the humaneness of the humanities, challenging hegemonic structures of research and epistemic dogmas that have been put into place over years, and also obviously to Prof. Christie van der Westhuizen and her amazing team that have put together this awesome conference that is running beautifully. So our next session, Plenary 3 on Parliament, Laws and Accountability, will be hosted by myself, Giovanni Poggi. I am a lecturer in political studies at Nelson Mandela University, and we'll just wait for our speakers to join. Okay, I've already seen Samantha has joined us, and let's just relax for a couple of minutes and get ready to kick off at 9 a.m.
Wonderful. It's quite a thing sitting here, silently staring at yourself on the screen this early in the morning for some of us. The human factor.
So, Samantha, are you close to the ocean?
I'm very close to the ocean.
I feel I can hear it in the background there.
I think you can, but I actually think a few minutes away.
Okay, the audience is ready and all three of our speakers have joined. So, I mean, why don't we rather just kick the session off 2 minutes earlier, maybe save us a little bit more time for Q&A later on. So, like I said earlier, this is Parliament, Laws and Accountability, Plenary 3. I have 3 speakers today, and in the order that they will speak, I have Zukiswa Kota of Rhodes University, I have Samantha Waterhouse of the University of Western Cape, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Abhigyan Guha from Jadavpur University in India. So in that order, let's go ahead with Zukiswa whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you, Giovanni, and good morning, everyone. Quite excited for today, and in particular, quite keen to hear from my colleagues on this panel. The paper covers aspects of reform in government and public administration broadly, but in this presentation, I'll focus on procurement, given the extraordinary moment in history that we find ourselves, the COVID-19 moment. So this moment offers also an opportunity to interrogate the state of the state, as well as to inform a reform agenda that prioritizes inclusion, fairness, and equity. In South Africa, public procurement carries constitutional obligations, and it's also recognized as a means of addressing apartheid-era discriminatory policies and practices. But this continues to be undermined by the deep fragmentation of laws governing procurement, and this also results in ineffective regulation and public oversight, which I'm excited to have Sam on the panel to talk about the oversight aspect of things where we have laxity. And as public procurement constitutes the single largest market product in South Africa, scrutiny of it is vital. Procurement is also central to managing public finances and to ensuring the transformative development, something we heard about on the first day of our conference. Since the proclamation of the disaster management regulations in March, was it February, March last year, a special investigations unit, or SIU briefing indicated that 12 billion rand, or for people not from South Africa, equivalent to about $900 million US, in questionable COVID-19 tenders were being investigated by February 2021. We've seen similar in other countries. In the United Kingdom, contracts estimated at 71 billion rand, which for them equates to a fifth of all COVID-19 contracts, were flagged for possible corruption. And aside from the special circumstances relating to the pandemic, the outcome of real-time auditing has shone a light on the pressing need for stronger anti-corruption safeguards. According to the World Bank, the regulation of public procurement is relatively new. With the exception of Japan and the United States in the late 1940s, most countries adopted procurement laws only as recently as the 1990s or 2000s. So in 2020, the South African National Treasury released a draft procurement bill to regulate public procurement and prescribe a revised framework for procurement aligned with Section 217 of the Constitution. It was also to, in many ways, close some of the gaps that had been identified. So while this constitutes a really important milestone in efforts to safeguard public resources, opaque and delayed processes pose barriers to potentially meaningful reform. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime cite procurement as government's single greatest corruption risk, public procurement. COVID-19 pandemic, as we've seen, has exacerbated or further exposed these deep fractures and inequalities in our country from a social, economic, and political context. But are these fractures fixable is what we're asking today, and how deep are they where procurement in particular is concerned? I'll speak of one case study to help with answering this question. And while it doesn't relate to the context of COVID-19 specifically, it bears many of the hallmarks of corrupt practice in the context of emergency procurement. So it's a case from Guyana in the Limpopo province. Many of us have heard of the Guyana bulk water project. We know that access to safe water and sanitation is a fundamental right within the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Water is essential for all life. I know this too well, living where I do in Makanda. Efficient procurement lies at the center of delivering these services. In recent years, the Auditor General in South Africa and the SIU have exposed numerous examples of activities aimed at subverting procurement and the Public Finance Management Act. Activities by water boards and other entities that fall under what essentially was the Department of Water and Sanitation, at the expense of the public and of public resources. So the Guyana case illustrates how emergency procurement and the use of emergency legislation can be used as mechanisms themselves to circumvent tender procedures and avoid scrutiny. Initiated in 2009, initially as an emergency drought intervention by the department, the project has been the subject of various court challenges, investigations, and delays. The impact of years of delay on this project are captured in a really quite heart-sought 2020 SABC television interview with a Guyana pensioner, Noa Ringani Shilenge, who in that interview laments that nearly 50% of her social grant income is spent on monthly purchases of water. Also profiled is the fact that the multi-million rand project has still not delivered any piped water to the 50 surrounding villages that it was meant to benefit. By 2019, the project had cost 2.5 billion rand, and by last year, those costs were climbing. A step back in 2012, a judge had ordered that the initial contract for the water pipeline be cancelled, following the revelation that the contracting company who the tender was awarded to had not existed prior to its awarding, not unlike what we've seen in the COVID-19 context. The decision was appealed, and as 2014 Supreme Court of Appeal then instructed the department to undertake remedial work. However, the incoming minister at the time, Minister Nomvula Mokonyane, contravened the SCA directives and instructed the water board to implement, to appoint an implementing agent and a consulting firm. It then later emerged that the minister herself had direct connections to the implementing or consulting firm LTE, who were appointed to oversee the project completion. LTE reportedly inflated the cost of their work and overcharged the department. Tender processes were not followed, contrary to requirements of remediation. In a parliamentary report, the minister stated that the department was complying with the court order and tender requirements. And despite non-delivery of piped water, which was really the project's core mandate, The department, the Water Authority, and the consulting firm then initiated a range of smaller projects. The majority of this occurred in the absence of proper technical planning, budgeting, or compliance with procurement requirements. So that the project's emergency inception was a response to a drought crisis, and that there were ready funds in the form of water infrastructure grants contributed to this corrupt practice. The ability of corrupt officials to set up compromised appointment panels and systems of oversight. So within that, they themselves were able to set up compromised systems of oversight, in addition to engaging complicit contractors, really made for quite a heady, toxic mix. There were many AXA Auditor General investigations, and a litany of PFMA tender irregularities came to the fore. The Guyani project, according to a special report by the Auditor General, had irregular expenditure owing to the Water Authority's deviation from normal procurement in response to a ministerial directive. So many issues around accountability in that context. The Guyani project underscores the risks inherent in accounting officers and ministers being afforded too much power and scope to influence procurement decisions, to the point of appointing implementing agents directly and ignoring court orders. In this case, the minister not only misled Parliament, but also was able to escape accounting for her role in the irregular appointment of a consulting firm that she herself had connections to. So that the case is a multi-layered one, but at the core of it lies weak, overturned procurement processes and abuse of power by the executive and other key role players along the supply chain monitoring line. And here, monitoring and oversight become fundamental. So despite expenditure in the billions of rands, the bottom line has not been met. Basic water services have not been delivered. 90,000 people who were meant to access water in the villages surrounding Guyani are still without, have scarcely improved water services more than a decade later. So to conclude, transparency is really undoubtedly an important safeguard, but it isn't a silver bullet. Promoting proactive disclosure of procurement information is vital as a means of supporting monitoring activities, monitoring and oversight. And here again, I emphasize the oversight and parliamentary role. The same is true of public expenditure and public infrastructure data. Secondly, introducing open contracting and implementing open data standards such as the Open Contracting Partnerships, Open Contracting Data Standards would help. So this is a specific kind of set or system of openness in contracting. It includes the publication of comprehensive procurement and contracting information from all phases of procurement cycle and all organs of state online. Access to comprehensive infrastructure information about public projects would also vastly improve oversight. The National Treasury and Office of the Chief Procurement Officer can really embark on implementing open contracting, which would boost integrity in the procurement cycle. In relation to public infrastructure projects, developments in open data platforms by the National Treasury and Department of Public Works are promising. So there is some promising work currently being undertaken in this context to improve accountability. Third, we must prioritize preventative actions, such as the automation of systems to more speedily and better detect conflicts of interest, particularly where politically exposed persons are concerned. Then we can speak of beneficial ownership data, which can be used to help detect potential signs of bid rigging and conflicts of interest. The organization Open Ownership highlights that South Africa has an existing definition of a beneficial owner in the Financial Intelligence Center Act, and that further refining that to ensure a more comprehensive net is needed. We've also heard the former Finance Minister, Trevor Manuel, in his response to now former Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, when he was lamenting that there were thieves waiting at the door for the opening of COVID contracts. He emphasized that provisions in the current act do provide the minister powers to tackle politically exposed persons and their families implicated in nefarious activities. And finally, procurement policies have weak transparency provisions in spite of relevant constitutional requirements. The draft public procurement bill, which aims to introduce important transparency safeguards, has now been deferred indefinitely. And our queries to the Minister of Finance and related executives have thus far elicited limited guidance on meaningful next steps. The Giyani water debacle underscores several issues in current procurement practice that require reform to avoid similar deviations and misuse in future. And so while there are really important developments to fix the fractures, delayed reform really will continue to have dire consequences for meeting the country's developmental and social justice goals. Thank you. That's me done.
And with 2 minutes to spare, thank you so much, Zukiswa. That was a wonderful presentation, and if somewhat depressing presentation to start the morning. I think it's obviously something that we all feel very strongly about, particularly where taxpayers' money goes and that kind of thing. I'm reminded of the fact that I can't remember where I watched this. I think it was an Economist documentary or something, where there are a few countries now that are using sort of technology or anti-corruption technology, where public officials are requested to basically log every activity that they do. And perhaps we should be moving towards something like that, more implementing software that can detect conflicts of interest and that kind of thing. I believe we're going to have the Q&A session after every speaker has spoken. So what I'm going to do is ask you to put your comments and questions in the Q&A section. I know that the Q&A section has a word limit, so if you have a slightly longer comment, you could probably pop it in the chat, but let's try and keep the comments and questions short and concise anyway. And with that, I'm going to hand over to our second speaker for the day, Samantha Waterhouse. I'll let her introduce her paper to us. Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone here. Names on a screen. Some of you have actually got pictures of your faces around me because of this business of conferencing via screens. I'm Sam. I'm at UWC. I work with Women and Democracy Initiative. And what I wanted to center on is the work that we do around legislatures. I work with a range of organizations and structures, including Parliament Watch, which is a collective of quite diverse organizations and people. So what I'll be talking to are my own reflections, but hugely influenced and informed by other people's experiences. Time's not going to allow me to reference everyone as well as I should, but there will be in the written version. So I'm going to just jump in because I'm scared of this timer. And Zuki said I must be very scared of our moderator. I wanted to start out by zooming back a little bit and locating legislatures in the democracy and noticing that when we talk about informal ways about democracy, not we, but when democracy is spoken about, we talk about these three branches or these three arms. And very seldom does the framing in terms of what should be done go beyond that. So I wanted to add that layer of publics very squarely, which I think a conference like this does, and many of the speakers, I think it was centered in the keynotes and so on along the way. But I want to also locate that we're talking about a democracy that's got these formal institutions and has publics. And also within that, there's private sector, and I've got in brackets here, that's for another paper and probably another speaker, possibly Toko Madonko here in the audience. But I think it's important to do that because it means that we keep centering on this idea that the answer doesn't necessarily lie only in the institutions. And especially for me, who works on an institution and is here presenting a paper about an institution where my heart doesn't necessarily think all the answers lie. So I think this idea that we're not a passive public, we're not a receptive waiting for public, and certainly not in the South African context, but I think globally. Then I just wanted to start off, I talk about the soul of the legislatures, these lofty, kind of slightly poetic, aspirational ideas that I was flowing as I was writing the abstract. But what I wanted to do is name that when I read the discourse and when I engage with the conversations about legislatures, there's been a progression from understanding its lawmaking function to, as Zuki's talking about, engaging with what does it mean to give, what meaning do we give to its oversight roles, and then to this question more recently, loud and clear, its accountability function, its function of holding the executive, the people of whom Zuki has spoken, to account. That's the conversation, but very seldom do I hear the centering of this idea that those functions are meant to follow its representative role. And as the Constitution puts it, to ensure that we have a government based on the will of the people. So I want to put that in the middle of the room. When we read the Constitution, you see it's quite clearly articulated. It's not hard to find. If you read Constitutional Court judgments, you see beautiful languaging around what the meaning is of legislatures in these terms. And I would encourage, I wanted to quote things, but there's no time, but I would really encourage that we read them. So we see that there's a clear understanding that the legislatures are a space for the people and that are about governance by the people. But that is easier said, obviously, than practiced. And that's what we're seeing is this complete, or I would say an absolute non-practicing of that principle. And it's for that reason I think that it's worth repeating this kind of message often, even though it may sound trite in a room such as this. Then I want to just move to some of my thoughts on the status quo, how they're doing. And I must nod, there's value. If you look globally, we can see that there is value added by the transparencies and the access that we have if you compare us on any kind of scale. But I wanted to say that those values have been fought for originally in the setup, but also we've been fighting as members of society, different parts of the publics over the last 25 years as well. It's not like we were given them and they've been cool. So, and it's been a battle and it's ratcheted up, as we know, in the last 12 or so years. So I wanted to say that what is good because it can be leveraged by an active civil society, because we can have a PMG, a parliamentary monitoring group in the room, because we can have journalists such as Christy van der Westhuizen was or Marianne Merton is, who are able to get in there and use the spaces. So it's not in and of themselves, I think, that those things are good. Then I'll just show you, here's my didn't make it on the weekend presentation, but I've got lists and lists of the fact of the failings, and that isn't news to anyone in this room, that our legislature is a fail as we sit today, and legislatures, in fact. And I'm not going to go through the list from 1999 to today of evidences, but it's led in now in the center of our minds by the Zondo Commission, but there's plenty before it. I have a note also, segueing and jumping fast, on the public finance role. And I did want to say that despite our constitution saying you can't raise or spend public money without decisions being taken by a body representing the public, our parliament with its powers has literally made no action to intervene on the decisions of the executive over the past years. And as we've listened through this conference to the raging inequality, literally the rage that's happening around inequality, the desperation. Our parliament that represents the people is consistently passing these austere budgets, these tax hikes and so forth. So I'm getting on the roll now. The insults are coming. There's swear words on my page that I showed my colleagues yesterday that I won't be saying, but the insults on us as public, as South Africans, and I do understand my positionality, the insult on me is lower than the insult on the majority of South Africans. But they keep rolling as we see the new speakers being announced and the people being put back into the benches of Parliament who are so obviously not in the people's interests. So we go back to that list I didn't read out. It included some reports and recommendations over the years, from the electoral reform, the need to shift the power of the political party, given the dominance we have of the ANC, to the technical, the independent panel assessment of Parliament. And I notice in op-eds and on spaces like this, every now and again, people like me pop our heads up and say, we've got to revive these. Their answers are here. But it doesn't go anywhere. They're quite dead in the water. These things tend to focus on technical aspects, on the kind of what should we do within the systems, what mechanisms should we increase, what kind of what measures can be written down and should be forced and adhered to. So there's that kind of technical, and then there's the political, which is at the bigger systems, the will, who has the power and where is power residing. I'm a bit jaded about the technical. I feel like we get assimilated in those processes of commenting on rules and norms and laws. I don't think that it's, as we can see from Zuki's own presentation, it's not affecting whether people have the water. You know, it's not affecting what happens. So I am jaded, but at the same time, I'm cautious. The people who know me, I'm cautious because I know the devil is in that detail too. So I do think those technical things must be fought for. They must be known and we must work for them. But on the politics, I wanted to turn to that question that we know. I'm not telling anyone what you don't know. The way our system is set up and the way we vote as a nation means that there is no power in the legislature. But there are battles happening, right? It's meant to be, as we heard last night, it's meant to be this pluralistic space for contestation and diversity. So there is a battle there. Some of the battles, you can hear me racing, I'm checking my 6 minutes, 18 seconds. Some of the battles have been spoken on in the panel on lawfare. So there's some kind of battle between the courts and parliament. Who is it who centers around social justice and the public in this country, if it's not the legislatures and the debates of moving over? We see, or no, we don't see the struggle they're designed to do. One of the struggles that legislatures are designed for is a struggle between the executive and the MPs, the elected representatives. We don't see that playing out in our context. What we will see when we are aware of intra-ANC party struggles, they happen outside of parliament. MPs toe the line. The people in the space are not cleaving open any sense of disharmony in the ANC. So that's coming through outside. It's not our legislatures giving us that. The struggle of multi-party, that this is a multi-party space, this isn't a ruling party space, continues, and that we're all witnessing. It's got louder as things are televised. The EFF moments brought a whole lot of new content to our understanding of how that space could be used in those ways. And I think we are benefiting as a result of that. And in fact, the Parley Watch partners are also keep, to our chagrin sometimes, reflecting, damn, those DA people do keep asking the question that needs to be asked. So sorry to put that on people. So I see that that struggle is happening. But I think if civil society have actually, we get used by in those kind of inter-party struggles. Have we asked how we can use them better in organized ways? I haven't been in a lot of spaces that are thinking about how we can maximize on that. For good reason, I think we don't rush in as fools would. Then, looking at my 4 minutes and knowing I've got 6 minutes of words at least by my own practice. So we can see that this public forum works well for people with an N, right? It works well for the chosen, the connected, people like me, perhaps people like us. We can get in and engage on the law reform. And while there are many people across the country who have engaged in real solid ways in legislature processes, often those that come down to local spaces, it's exceptional. It's not normal. And that there's quite a tremendous amount of gatekeeping between people who are not like me, the people who are the people, in my view, of this democracy, engaging with a structure that is supposed to be representative of the people. And in Parliament Watch, I mentioned earlier, that is a group made up of people like us, so some NGOs, academic types, but it's also made up of rural activists working with community advice officers, urban activists that are linked to larger social movements. So people who are affected by these things that we speak of directly. And people there who are saying, we want to connect our work at local level with oversight at national level, and trying to do it. So saying that there is a value for us as a sector, civil society, to keep expanding on who engages. But I think there's a question for NGOs about how we become gatekeepers ourselves and what kind of integrity we show if we are playing any kind of facilitative role to move towards getting others in the room, so to speak. In terms of the question of imaginings for the futures and fixes, I don't know the answer to that. I keep reading everything people, like the people in this room and everywhere around me, are saying. I'm listening. I don't know what all the fixes are. I do know that the question does keep coming up, and it's louder in the more activist-oriented spaces that I participate in. What's the point? Why would we go to these legislatures? And as that question comes up over and over, those same people and the peoples like me are saying, there is a reason we do need to keep doing this. We're not ready to give up on the soul, this idea that this is a space that represents people. And I think that the message is we can't afford not to. In the system we have, we can't afford not to try pushing and keep claiming this space. But importantly, we've got to be mindful that this is an institution, a colonial one with history that it follows. And so our impact as outsiders is always going to be limited on that space. There are these expressions for an activist, people-centered parliament that were loud at the beginning of the democracy and very much literally got taken off the webpage around 2009. How do we as outsiders give more meaning and more pressure to create a legislature or legislatures that are activist and engaged? So I've got more things. I think the point I'm trying to hold there is that we are outsiders to an institution, and there are limits to how far we can go. And I think I've spoken to some of the ways that there are gains for us, mostly that it gives us information to use and to keep fighting against things being hidden, those big and small skeletons that can keep getting hidden. So it provides us a platform, but it's about how we use it. But to that question, the answer also does come that we shouldn't. And if I may, I've literally got a few more, so I might just go like 30 seconds over, if I can just have the freedom to breathe a bit and say this last part. And the two reasons, the obvious reason that comes up is that people speak about the costs. I'm working here towards getting water, or there's somebody who's in labor and she can't get medical help. That's what I need to be doing today. Not going and sitting with an honorable this and an honorable that for no effect. So there's that kind of cost that is preventative. There's the physical distance and all those sorts of things. And as I said, the gatekeeping and management that people like me end up playing and how we do that. But the other reason is that we understand that for the big changes, they don't happen inside institutions. They happen outside of these institutions. And every word that was spoken in the platforms in this conference confirms over and over that we know this. And so that's a reason not to as well. It's a reason for us not to over-focus on our work in the inside of the institutions at the expense of the work that must happen on the outside. And I'm not the person to lead us in conversations like that. Abhigyan, I saw the content and the title of your presentation, and I suspect you're taking us towards that place. I see today at 3 o'clock, there's a panel where these are the questions for discussion, reimagining, Africanizing democracy. And I want to be part, I want to be listening, I want to be in solidarity with those kinds of conversations. So here I am talking about the legislatures, but in my heart, I know it's just one piece of a puzzle. And I don't think that it's where the real sea change is going to happen. And Poppy says, time up. Poppy had to come on the stage. Sorry, everyone.
Thank you, Samantha. That was another wonderful presentation. I'm just thinking back to, I've got some chatter on my screen there. Abhigyan, do you mind just muting your mic for a second? I think it's coming from your side. There we go. Okay, so yeah, I was actually just thinking, before this panel started, that quite a high bar was set yesterday, and I was wondering whether or not that would be maintained, and it seems as though it has been thus far. Your presentation was great. I think a fight for the soul, indeed. I've got a lot of comments and ideas ringing in my head here, but for me, what was interesting was what you said about, this beautiful language to describe legislatures, but at the same time, I'm also feeling that this talk about soul, etc., this a soulless commitment of legislatures to uphold that type of institution. I'm thinking back to Fees Must Fall, and I have some colleagues in the room here that at the time of Fees Must Fall went out to present to parliamentary committees on making free education a possibility and an easy possibility in terms of the budgetary constraints of the state. And they were met with just complete ambivalence. The legislatures, the legislators couldn't care less. And I think Parliament oftentimes makes no effort to rein in the executive. And as someone that works on African politics at a continental level, I can say that South Africa is not the only country that is, at fault for this. That it happens in many African countries that the legislature is sort of complicit in their ambivalence towards crisis. They need to be counteracted with the things that you were saying about, parliamentary monitoring groups and civil society gatekeepers and that kind of thing. We need to keep the strength of those things alive. Okay, so just moving on to our last speaker now. We are still under time for this session, which is nice. So we'll have a lot of time for Q&A at the end. I just want to remind people to keep on posting their questions and comments in the Q&A for me to look at later. And let's hand over to Abhigyan Guha for the final presentation of this session, whenever you're ready.
I hope I'm audible.
You are.
Okay, thank you so much. So my paper is a rumination. It's basically a normative, macroscopic, comprehensive assessment of the ongoing farmers' protest movement in India. And being the odd man out in the whole conference and the only one, I guess, from India, so I think, so let me put things into perspective first. Now, we all know that how the ongoing global democratic recession and the retreat of globalization has been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic and altering the global leadership footprint, signaling the rise of illiberal populism, ultranationalist political formations, and reinvigorating the autarkic nostalgia. And India has been a victim whereby its economic downturn has been worsened into a Keynesian tailspin. Now, characterized by post-colonial anxieties and its feudal inertia in the form of an oppressive caste system, India is predominantly an agrarian economy with 70% of its population still relying entirely on successes in its agricultural sector, a fundamental subsistence. Quite interestingly, the Indian political establishment's robust democratic tradition component of dissent are ingrained in its social fabric, and history has been witness to the episodic experimentation with mass agitations and consolidated pan-Indian protests on socio-economic, political, and cultural grounds, complementing macro-societal transformation. Internalizing the Gandhian elements of Satyagraha and Swaraj, the various protests were grounded in their non-violent teleological commitment to truth and freedom, whereby the crystallization of agrarian class consciousness accompanied the discursive articulation of civil disobedience, freedom of expression in a democratic manner, with historical instances ranging from the Bardoli or Champaran Satyagraha during India's freedom movement to the Tebaga and the Naxalbari uprising in the post-colonial landscape that was rich in the anti-feudal and anti-colonial credentials. Now, notwithstanding the technocratic leap associated with the Green Revolution in the 60s and the 70s, the Indian farming community, even in the post-revolution beneficiary states of Punjab, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh in northern India, continued to suffer from deeply rooted structural, institutional maladies and persistent agrarian distress, namely low productivity, fragmented land holdings, lack of storage infrastructure, high indebtedness, unfinished agenda in land reform, issues with quantity and quality of water, technological fatigue, problems of access, adequacy and timeliness of institutional credit, and opportunities for assured and remunerative marketing coupled with adverse meteorological factors that exacerbate these pre-existing issues, leading to increased instances of farmer suicides. Now, in the present political scenario, with the 2014 general elections electing an avowedly right-wing National Democratic Alliance led by Narendra Modi's BJP into power, India's foundational constitutional attributes, a secular pluralistic heterogeneity and democratic ethos underlying its cooperative federalism, have suffered a massive blow with the debilitation of horizontal and vertical accountability as vital democratic indicators, decisively aborting Indian polity's inherent centrist circumference, constructing the monolithic block of Hindustan, propelled by the project of belligerent homogenized Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, emboldening a triumphant majoritarian edifice that reeks the language of authoritarian populism, economic protectionism, and the chauvinistic politics of hegemonic articulation. From openly batting for Hindu causes, scrubbing minority insignia to encouraging differential treatment under the law, the de facto regime advocates a hard militaristic nationalism which is imbued with religious fervor. Additionally, it conflates the ruling political party, the government, and ultimately with the nation state in one strong continuum, while mocking the language of moderation as weak pacifism. Against this backdrop, in September 2020, the controversial unilateral parliamentary enactment of 3 pieces of legislation, that is the Indian Agricultural Acts of 2020 or the Farm Bills in India's upper chamber Union Legislature or Rajya Sabha, done in disorderly haste, intended to initiate sweeping changes to the workings of the nation's agricultural markets by removing existing restrictions on the marketing of farm products so as to allow farmers to negotiate directly with private buyers, aiming at increasing agricultural productivity, bolstering deregulation of the agricultural sector, rampant privatization and corporatization, sparked of intense nationwide protests from the farming sector under the coordination of farmers' union bodies like the Samyukt Kisan Morcha, the United Farmers Front, and the All India Kisan Sangharsh Coordination Committee, demanding the immediate revocation of 3 agricultural reform bills, that is the Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement on Price Assurance and Farmer Services Bill, the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Bill, and the Essential Commodities Amendment Bill, and the introduction of legal provisions for assuring a minimum support price or MSP for farming produce. As the 3 impugned farm bills are facing severe criticism for endangering food security, reducing the bargaining and negotiating power of farmers, exposing the agrarian sector to the vulnerabilities of market, when the corporate private players dictate the terms of negotiation, the consolidated pan-Indian farmers' protests are grounded in both procedural and substantive issues. On the procedural front, the hurried approach of the central government in rushing with the 3 pieces of legislation in the parliament without full-fledged deliberations in both the houses of the Union Parliament, its apathy of non-engagement with the relevant stakeholders, the centre's shameful failure in its inability to construct a federal consensus on a subject like agriculture, which is a state subject under the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, catalyzed state governments in spearheading the criticism against the center for compromising federal democratic principles, adding political mileage to the farmers' agitation. On the substantive aspects of the laws in questions, the agri farmers believe that the legislation is a harbinger to the abolition of the public procurement and the MSP or the minimum support price regime, and public procurement and MSP are major instruments which the protesting farmers feel are indispensable for their survival. As the law suggests, there will be an end to the monopoly procurement by the Agricultural Produce Market Committee or the APMC, which the agitating farmers feel will be catastrophic to their long-term interests, fearing that the state governments will fail to collect market fee, cess or levy for trade outside the APMC markets, and the laws will eventually dismantle the status quo, pushing them to directly deal with corporate interests. The chief concern is that the current laws pose a significant challenge to small and marginal farmers, constituting 86% of India's agricultural class, and additionally, the farm laws exclude the state and central governments and also the civil courts to intervene in any matter pertaining to subjects covered under them, thus depriving the farmers of independent dispute redressal mechanisms. Chiefly employing Gandhian tools of agitation, namely Satyagraha, non-violent civil resistance, peaceful sit-in demonstrations or dharnas and rail blockades, reminiscent of India's anti-colonial movement, the largest organized human strikes in history, featuring over 250 million farmers, spearheaded by over 40 farmers' unions sitting peacefully in the national capital of Delhi since the unilateral enactment of the farm laws in September 2020 has constituted a watershed moment demonstrating extraordinary resilience and firm commitment to India's long tradition of participatory democracy. The stages of the farmers' protest till November 2020 were typified by multiple peaceful sit-ins, railway and highway blockades in the states of Punjab and Haryana, and owing to the lack of response or redressal from the central government, and in the meetings held on October 14th and November 13th, the farmers collectively decided to stage a non-violent protest in the national capital on 26 November. The actions of the repressive state machinery to stifle the peaceful movement by using coercive means went against the very spirit of democracy and were violative of the right to assemble peacefully and freedom of movement enshrined within the country in Article 19 of the Indian Constitution, Article 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 21 and 22 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which are signed and ratified by India. Initially, the government tried to curb these peaceful agitators by barricading the highways, digging trenches in the roads, and parking heavy trucks filled with sand on the roads leading to Delhi. And the police even used water cannons, empty tear gas shells, lathi charge on unarmed farmers without considering their safety during the pandemic. Subsequently, on 26 January 2021, the peaceful tractor rally organized by the farmers turned violent as the police used tear gas and excessive force to dispel the protesters, firing rubber bullets and injuring many, and in consequence, the authorities imposed legal restrictions on the peaceful assembly of people. Enforcing the same, innumerable protesters were forcefully physically detained with legal cases filed against the farmer union leaders, and state authorities have fortified the borders of the national capital by the use of spikes, concrete barricades, and trenches to prohibit the entry of protesters, disrupting internet and telecommunication services, avoiding accessibility of basic provisions of food, water, clothing, waste disposal, shelter, and sanitation facilities, displaying a gross violation of human rights, especially right to health and human dignity, while curtailing basic civil liberties. Transcending the Indian deep state's arrogation of powers and the language of securitization of 2020 and 21 indeed constitute a landmark in India's political history. And even though the center appeared to be superficially concerned about the agrarian section after months of intense, protracted agitation by initiating negotiations with the farmers' unions to diffuse the protests and accommodate their demands, any compromise has proved evasive till now because everything is an eyewash, because the protesters would not accept any offer apart from the complete MSP regime, apart from the complete withdrawal of the 3 laws and a legislative guarantee for continuing with the MSP regime-based status quo. Several lessons can be drawn from the farmers' agitation, especially as the movement, instead of being critical of the Indian nationhood, effectively deployed patriotism to critique the majoritarian aggressive Hindu nationalist state dispensation, the energy of the anti-colonial struggle to redefine and reclaim post-colonial nationalism from the state. Secondly, through a constant reminder of the significance of agriculture in modern post-colonial nation-state vis-a-vis reinforcing Gandhian normative and ideational elements, and by invoking citizens' rights, the constitution, the judiciary, the farming community managed to stake their claim in the history and the future of democratic consolidation of India. Thirdly, by internalizing an intersectional pluralistic orientation while being inclusive of all religions and drawing its historical legacy from Sikhism, the movement and its supporters managed to create a new text of religious tolerance and empathy, a secularism that genuinely acknowledges and practices and preaches the strength of multi-religious India instead of subverting it violently. The enduring significance of the ongoing farmers' protests illustrates something beyond the struggle of the agrarian class for their rights to be consulted before the laws are enacted on their behalf to profit the multinational corporations and transnational corporations. And essentially, it is a unique pan-Indian movement thriving on its participants' indomitable self-reliance and community-based sovereignty, and through their collective dissent against 3 agricultural reform laws, it stands for a collective fight for land ownership, autonomy, preservation of a way of life, and socio-cultural identity, class consciousness, and identity, transcending beyond the realm of contestation against deregulation or crony capitalism. A democratic and peaceful consolidated protest based on substantive concerns should not be discredited for the momentary interests of political mileage and electoral expediency, and thus the movement is a wake-up call for the ruling regime that under the presence of democratic conditions, it must strive hard with good faith in order to constantly prioritize the possibilities of prolonged repeated negotiations, deliberations, and consultations in order to effectively address the collective concerns of the protesting agrarian community while finding a comprehensive and sustainable and enduring solution, irrespective of how vexed the issue in question is. And thus, the central government must not leave any stone unturned in materializing a broad-based consensus while mitigating the exacerbating crisis. Now, all these claims might appear to be utopian or unrealistic, especially how the government has reacted in silencing each and every single voice of the dissent. Now, apart from the direct use of force against the protesting farmers, the government adopted indirect techniques of using the state machinery to weaken the movement by sending investigation agencies after the farmers and organizations aiding the protest, conducting and inquiries, summoning farmer leaders and NGO organizers with cases registered against them under the Indian Penal Code and Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, civil society human rights defenders by arresting them under sedition charges, imposing complete information and broadcasting blackout, freezing the assets of human rights organizations, and clamping down on every single voice of dissent. Now, we are living in an uncharted territory. We don't know what the future holds of the farmers' protest and how the future is going to move forward with regard to the final and enduring solution and the resolution of the crisis. So I would like to conclude my exposition on a pessimistic note, and I hope that the sun might rise again on an optimistic note. So thank you.
Wow, wow, wow. We are 3 for 3 on great presentations in this session so far. Thank you to our final speaker there. Learning lessons from the Indian farmers movement has definitely given us a lot of food for thought. And yeah, I think, it's concerning, even if we look at it comparatively between us and India, that, with turns towards right-wing directions and authoritarian tendencies and that kind of thing, that now more than ever civil society collectives need to sort of push back against that. And it's actually interesting as well. I made told that short anecdote about fees must fall after Samantha's presentation, and again, it's interesting to see how in India with the farmers movement, that peaceful protests were met with state enacted violence. And I found that fascinating about our democracies and the practice of authority and the policing systems, that when there is rape, murder, and robbery committed, the authorities are nowhere to be found. Here in South Africa, you could wait for over an hour, 2 hours for police to come to the scene of a murder. But when the people stand up to the state, the authorities are there within a matter of seconds to fire rubber bullets and tear gas at them. So it's an indictment on our authorities, both in India and in South Africa. But I really loved what you said about how there was this obsession created with nationalism and even a kind of ethnic nationalism in India in recent years, and how that farmers collective was able to sort of reuse patriotism and sort of taking the state's obsession with nationalism and kind of using it against them. And that's really a fantastic thing that they did there. I think what we should do now is perhaps jump to the Q&A. There isn't much in the way of Q&A questions right now, but I do have a couple thus far. I'm going to start off with a question for Zukiswa from Janet Cherry, who is asking, is there a problem with the legislation, the PFMA in particular?
Thanks, Giovanni and Janet. I think perhaps the one area of emphasis that I could have been stronger on was to speak to the relative ease with which PFMA provisions are overturned in the context of procurement. And so the weakness to some extent is less by way of the provisions or the legislation themselves, and more in their implementation and lack of consequences for failure to implement, and for accounting officers in particular to follow through. The procurement context, and I think this was also really important to emphasize, is one that's very complex in this country and in many countries. And I think it's also why it is a space that also has limited oversight. It's technical, it's complex, and brings together a lot of very complicated and expertise, even in the context of oversight. So the decentralized nature of procurement is another layer of kind of complexity that's introduced. So when we talk about weaknesses within the procurement context, it's precisely why the procurement bill has been such a hot topic. It's precisely why so many civil society organizations and business and other kind of interests within the public have been really geared at strengthening it, at submissions. We were told that, in addition to those that we know of, there were dozens, hundreds of submissions made on the procurement bill when it came out. It was long awaited, and when it came out, there were people who were really wanting to help to strengthen it for various reasons, not least of which because of the fundamental weaknesses within the kind of fragmented and complex and sometimes hamstringing legislation that goes with the PFMA, with procurement law. The other aspect, and I think now speaks to why the Auditor General's powers were amended in relation to the Public Audit Act. Much of that also relates to the identification of so many issues of accountability, weak accountability, and subverting of procurement legislation. So, Janet, I would say that the answer is, the problems are less about the strength and the kind of robustness of the PFMA, and certainly far more in the linked systems within procurement law. The same was true within the National Health Insurance Bill. When we looked at that, for instance, immediately the alarm bells were around the requirements at the kind of decentralized and subnational, provincial and district level for really complicated procurement processes and expertise that is non-existent in many instances. So there's a lot that we can talk about. One really important, or one example that comes to mind in the context of public procurement is, again, the transparency issues. Only a small percentage of procurement and contracting information is actually made available. And there is no, supporting kind of mechanisms and legislated requirements to make that information available. If you were to look at provincial entities right now, departments, we've spent a great deal of time trying to find, for example, some uniformity to be able to compare procurement of PPE, for example, province to province, district to district. At this point, it actually is impossible. I can share with you a tool that we put together to try and make sense of it. If someone was wanting to track between the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape, for instance, are masks being procured at the same cost, identical items, and that's information, or that's with like investigative journalism, journalists on hand, kind of data analysts on hand, still really difficult to elicit. That shouldn't be the case. So I definitely think, and this is why I say it's a shining light in some respects. And we gave input on the draft procurement bill quite at length, looking at would the bill in its current state, the draft bill in its current state, help us with fighting, as an anti-corruption mechanism, or would it in fact have more of the same? And at this point, it's a milestone, it's an important intervention, but there are significant issues even within the bill as it stands. So I really think I don't want to sound as if I'm, or underestimating the complexity of procurement. I am not. And I think it is important, though, to kind of really say, current legislation and current, the complementary legislation is simply not enough. And that's why we are where we are at present.
I don't have any other burning questions right now, but I actually want to go to a fascinating debate that is developing in the chat section, and I'm wondering if I mean, I suppose all of our speakers could comment on it, because it fits the general theme of this particular discussion about what is our role. And yeah, like I said, it looks like it's a little bit of a debate that's cooking up here. So Ashraf Adams says, I'm going to just read them out quickly. Zukiswa and Samantha sound as if they are operating in parallel to the democratic system. In that respect, I ask, do you attend the forums of democracy in your wards? What consciousness raising is required for citizens to use the democratic system to make it as participatory as designed? There is no alternative to mass consciousness to promote and protect democracy. Sounds like complaints without engagement, because you see yourselves as outsiders looking in. Democracy is hard work, and establishing a new democracy is even harder. Journalists do it well. Why not academics? So I would like to give Samantha and Zukiswa the opportunity to respond to that.
Well, firstly, I mean, lots of layers in that. So thank you for the direction. I think we're on board with, or I'm on board with the scope of what Ashraf is raising in that comment. I take the critique. I think that it's critical for us to be very, as you would have heard as I spoke, to name who we are, and for me to name who I am and from what space I'm speaking, and not trying to pretend to be all things that I'm not. That's lots of debates on that. So there are reasons why I think it's important to name the limits, and for us to, in this kind of way, be critical of what it is we do. I don't agree that we're sitting passively in the parallel outside space, but that's for me to not agree and for other people to have their views on. I would love my bosses to see that, because they complain about how unacademic we are because we're so busy being in solidarity with activist spaces, not writing the papers. We're listening. And I have actually here, I told you at the beginning, I've put some pictures of Zoom meetings that I've been in. People that I work with regularly and engage with regularly in this work. And for sure, I think we are doing what we can from our position, my position, ours, and when I say ours, I mean our project, to, I mean, the words I've got here are solidarity, to work with, and to be conscious and critical of the ways that those of us who are in the NGO or the academic space often just take space away from people. That's very different, in my view, to standing on the outside and kind of complaining about a structure. The reality, I think, that's come through in all these presentations, the Indian example as well, is the fact is, at the end of the day, we are helpless. In real terms, I can go in over and over and over, and I do still do it, into a legislature, but I do not control the decision making. So when we center the conversations, as was in my presentation, on a legislature, there is a reality of helplessness. And I feel like everything that's come out, I love this phrasing that you used, Abhigyan. Sorry, I got your name wrong, forgive me. But this phrasing of the watershed, the changes that happen when there is this mobilization, the reference to the fees must fall, the reference to the total shutdown, well, my reference to the total shutdown, there you see a shift happening. And I think that is, for me, important to say, that we have to act outside, and it's not a helpless expression of being an outsider. It's an incredibly powerful expression. And for me, often as a supporter in solidarity, I'm there in a particular kind of role that my positionality says is more appropriate for me. But the fact is, that's a powerful place. And that's what I'm talking about. So it's the opposite of being helpless and going, well, we'll just sit here and complain about the bloody ANC again. it really is about standing in power and standing in solidarity and working towards. So I think those are the main things I wanted to say. It does take my brain back to, then it takes us to the details again. So we have these watershed moments. We get finally the movement, if it's on gender-based violence, if it's on land, whatever that thing is that we've described as the examples. And then what? So very often what the state does is it controls us back inside. It pulls us back to the inside now as we iron through the details. And that, I think, is where we, again, not helpless, but again, shouldn't let go of the centering of the outside. And if I just look at Parliament, and I speak for myself, there's such a profound, swear word, arrogance in a lot of the people like me who go in there and pontificate and share our theories, and we walk out there patted on the back because we've served our democracy, and it's not where the change happens. And I speak for 20 years working on violence against women through this kind of route. It doesn't work. I'm not saying people like me shouldn't do it, or anyone shouldn't do it. Of course we should. But when we do it thinking that we shouldn't be doing this mass work, that is what is ignorant. I think I've tirade.
Yeah, so just bells ringing in my ears as you're speaking there, Samantha. And I think Ashraf's concern is warranted, because many people could sort of have the misconception that academics are just these sort of ivory tower individuals that kind of sit aside from the real issues of what's happening in society and kind of comment on them like they're some sort of like sports pundits, you know. But one has to also understand about the project of the humanities and the social sciences in South Africa at the moment. Prof. Maseko was talking about it in her welcoming address. You know, this is all part of the project, the larger project of humaneness of the humanities that particularly, I don't know if it's happening across the board in all faculties of education in South Africa, but definitely within the humanities and the social sciences, we are trying to be more on the ground, and most of us are working on the ground. I myself as well, I work with high school kids on civic and democratic education, so that they can understand the deeper aspects of elections, not just what they see superficially. And all of us are kind of doing work on the ground in some sort of way. So I think it's just about defeating the misconception that we're doing that. So I want to move on. I'm pretty sure Zukiswa would like to build on Samantha's comment as well. So let me just give that to Zukiswa, and then we'll get back to the Q&A just now. But this is a good debate.
Yeah, thanks, Giovanni, and I'll admit, Ashraf's comments, there's a lot in there, but the one, I think, you know, the question he says or asks, what consciousness raising is required for citizens to use the democratic systems to make it as participatory as designed? And I mean, firstly, again, I think, you know, as with Sam, the one thing I do want to foreground is that in this context, in this kind of space of work, it's certainly not a space that I approach as an academic. I am not. My academic background is actually environmental science. In this space, you know, I'm very much, well, see myself very much as a practitioner, and that's why questions of supporting participatory spaces is precisely central to our work. And so I think there's a sense of either or that the question raises, and I don't believe that there is an either or. I believe that strengthening democratic context means that where, you know, the kind of institutional spaces are not serving their purpose, find ways to make them better. If it is about creating alternative, creative, other spaces in order to influence that, why not? One example in the context of Makhanda, where I live, we've worked alongside the municipality to identify opportunities for people who are not like myself, you know, who have great resources on hand, to better understand the IDP process, for instance, to better know what are the links between the lack of services in my street or in my ward and what happens in, what a council is responsible for. So Makhanda, as we speak, has, and I think there's again a little bit of progress there, is the first kind of local government authority that is currently within the open government context and looking to partner with civic actors, with business, with academics, with activists, with groupings like the Unemployed People's Movement and a range of others to better make the space as a participatory space work for the people it's meant to work with, or work for, in fact. At this point, I may be, a little bit starry-eyed and rose-tinted glassy, but for me, the fact that the municipality has its, kind of stamp on that letter that says we want to try this, let's experiment, let's kind of strengthen the kind of local government and IDP participatory space using this project is a good thing. So that for me is one example of using the existing democratic system and participatory space to kind of make it better. If it's not good enough, make it better, fix it. And use those who are supposed to be making it work or kind of take them along for the ride. The other space at the national level, I think, is really an important one. The parliamentary space, the oversight and accountability space is one. I think there was a comment there, so why is there still so much corruption? And I think a big part of it is that perhaps, there isn't enough of the kind of creation of not parallel democratic spaces, but alternatives that can show and exhibit, hey, this can work in these ways. And there's a range of other work with civil society activists, both those that are community-based and those that, using the word elite, I think is tricky, but those who are not community-based, those who are not at the forefront of the struggles. So working, for example, with both community advice officers and your kind of research entities that sit at universities, for me is a really fundamental way of engaging a system that isn't working. It is not working. So there's a lot in what Ashraf raises that I think is, as you say, Giovanni, well worth noting, but I do not believe that it is an either-or context. It cannot be. Otherwise, I think I'll leave it there. But to say that I think it is important to be really reflective and reflexive about the ways in which we engage. And so raising issue with the current procurement context, raising issue with weak transparency mechanisms, raising issue with the ease with which the PFMA is disregarded by accounting officers is not to say that we want to create parallel systems. It is to say these are the ways, and this is why we make suggestions, this is why we make submissions. And Sam's question, or her paper questioning, should we be, we'll be in October just now in Parliament engaging with the Minister of Finance and asking for ways that the budget should be more feminist oriented, should be more, should recognize issues of inequality, should not hammer, provinces like ours even further by kind of really neoliberal, decision making. Should we even bother? The answer is yes. But what else can we do, and what else are we doing? So, sorry, I had said I would stop maybe 10 minutes ago, so maybe we should stop here now. Sorry.
Looking at those different modes of engagement, and I was just thinking now about at the local level. It's so fascinating to see that this development of alternative methods of communication and that kind of thing over the years. As our communications technology changes, how even in my area, people using WhatsApp groups now to engage in politics. So I believe there is this desire, but a lot of people just don't know where to place it. And so, as most of us do, we're on some sort of a neighborhood WhatsApp security group or something like that. And oftentimes people aren't talking about matters of security. They're talking about municipal issues. They're talking about water leaks. They're talking about potholes in the roads, lights that aren't fixed. So people are always actively looking for a way to engage with politics, but it seems oftentimes that it's stretched away from them, and they have to go and really find a way to get to it. So just before I move on there, I just wanted to also read Trevor Ngwane's response there, which I think is also very telling from the philosophical level. He said, but what kind of democracy are we establishing? Are we trying to establish a bourgeois capitalist type of democracy? this type of democracy is based on class, race, gender-based inequalities and injustices. There is thus a role for intellectual, theoretical, academic interrogation in addition to grassroots activism so that we understand the bigger picture, purpose, and challenges. Now, what I want to do now is move back to the Q&A and just bring Abhigyan back in again. I wonder if Abhigyan would like to comment on this discussion that's happening right now. But I also have another question for you from Christy van der Westhuizen, who has asked you to tell us more about the Gandhian modus operandi of the farmers' movement. But I don't know if you want to maybe comment on this conversation first from an Indian perspective, perhaps.
My mic working?
Fine.
Okay. Okay, so the question is, can I please stick to Dr. Christie's question for my own sake of convenience, if it's okay?
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay, so coming to the Gandhian modus operandi of the farmers' movement, I think democracy, in a sense, when it comes to how the Indian political landscape has evolved over the years, democracy in India stands for a dialogue. It is essentially a deliberate. It entails a deliberative and participatory function, which is internalized within the functionality of India's political process, rather than blindly replicating the Western liberal democratic project or the models or the parliamentary democracy. It has its own historical origins from the Westminster system, but Gandhi himself was very critical and apprehensive about the Western models of parliamentary democracy and how and he also pointed out its structural shortcomings. And Gandhi believed in the concept of Ram Rajya, which was the notion of enlightened anarchy. And he wanted to organize the society according to following a decentralized pattern of governance, wherein there was the concept of rural local self-government, in which the power was decentralized into different bodies, and there was this concept of enlightened anarchy or Ram Rajya. So taking cues from the Gandhian ideational and normative or the metaphysical body of Gandhian intellectual tradition, I think two essential elements, Satyagraha and Swaraj. Swaraj means essentially how you are the path towards non-violent civil resistance, and how you are creating effectively this voice and this very notion, this force of non-violent civil resistance and passive civil disobedience, how it can compel in order to in a gradualist way, not in a reactionary or violent revolutionary manner, the violent overthrow of status quo, but through peaceful non-violent means. And how Gandhi's teachings were appreciated, how Martin Luther King Jr. hailed Gandhi as the apostle of non-violence, how Nelson Mandela also invoked the Gandhian teachings in resolving the socioeconomic problems of hunger, poverty, corruption, unemployment, and different problems with regard to South Africa. And we're all familiar with how Gandhi had a proactive role in South Africa, and his historical role in the Kheda, Champaran, and Bardoli Satyagraha eventually, and how they constituted a milestone, and how they completely subverted all different forms of agitation, the tools of agitation, and constituted a new landmark moment, not only for India, but also for the entire human history. And so taking cues from the Gandhian political thought, I think that the tools of agitation that were followed by the farmers were mostly peaceful civil disobedience, or also non-violent civil resistance, and how they were chiefly non-violent and peaceful Indian means and methods of agitation and protest. So I hope I've answered your question. Yeah, thank you.
Fascinating there that came out for me is this, I'm just thinking of passive peaceful protest, what you were saying, and passive peaceful protest oftentimes tends to be the darling of the news media. They really catch on to that. And when you look at like the role of despotic politicians, they hate it. They absolutely hate passive peaceful protest. I think oftentimes when the state is actively working against its people, it loves when the people become violent, because then they can sort of use that violence to discredit them. Really an interesting thing. There's so much benefit to be achieved from passive peaceful protest. Okay, so I've got one more sort of general question here for now. I think if not two, even all three of the speakers could comment on it. A question from Tokozile Madonko, who says, are we not taking into account the holding of democratic space? For example, farmers are protecting their space. He's talking about the right to know campaign as well as secrecy bill. I'm also reminded of probably the biggest one South Africa has ever seen was the treatment action campaign. So we have a history of this, and I wonder who would like to comment on that. I see all three panelists nodding. Let me go in order with how we presented. So Zukiswa, you want to comment on that?
Actually feel I've heard more than enough of my voice. I'd be keen to to Abhigyan and Sam on that. It's a good question though.
Sam, you want to tackle it?
Yeah, it's interesting, these platforms, because now Giovanni, you read the other voices we'd normally hear, and there's a human interaction, bringing the human back, of hearing the tone of someone's voice, the rhythm of their speech. Thank goodness yours is quite lovely to listen to. But yeah, my comments on that point is here. If I've understood it, it's not a question, but it's giving us space to engage with this notion of democracy more broadly than within this kind of institutional way. And then all I wanted to say is to add an exclamation mark and an underline around it's about that we keep legitimizing those. And there's the histories you mentioned, TAC. One of my lectures is all the ways that movements in South Africa, equal education, whether it's small ways, the traditional courts bill process, regardless of where we are now, it took long because of people acting. So I think, yes, to keep legitimizing that. And again, where our focus is very much on thinking of ourselves in systems of people, thinking of the humanity, thinking of our power and our place in those struggles, so that we don't end up dividing ourselves and fighting because we don't agree with strategies and approaches. So I feel like to achieve those kinds of outcomes, it is about really embracing the meaning of plurality amongst them. But here to the point.
And I'm also just thinking now from Abhigyan's part of the world, another famous scholar, Gayatri Spivak, and her notions on the role of those people who are subaltern. Yeah, where do they find their voice? How do they find their voice? I don't know if you wanna just comment on that for a minute.
Well, absolutely. I think that how the systemic and institutionalized otherization and the discrimination have subdued the voices of the subaltern community, especially the Dalit community, for ages, for centuries, and how nowadays within the civil society, within academic circles and policy circles, even within the political process, they are finding somewhat space to raise their voices, raise their concern. Nowadays, the political parties, they have changed the electoral agenda, they have changed the electoral calculus by adopting a more pluralistic and inclusive approach, especially while fielding their candidates. And also, on one hand, while the democratic space is shrinking, owing to the challenge of illiberal populism, authoritarian, this ultranationalist political designs, we also see the proliferation of cyberspace, the proactive role of civil society and social media in voicing, and harboring the voices of dissent. So I think that democracy entails there is a certain notion of protean quality of elusiveness, a notion of dynamism, and it is continuously evolving with time, and we need to keep pace with all the evolving trends and transformations. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
In my Q&A bar that we have 19 seconds remaining, but because we're running ahead of time, I imagine that, you know, we should be breaking from 10:30 onwards. So if there is more to be said on these conversations, maybe we can still stretch it for another 5 minutes or so. There's another question here for Abhigyan. It seems as though it's anonymous. I don't know how you even post an anonymous question. He said the question is, you mentioned the use of a mix of secularism and multi-religious pluralism in the activism. That sounds like a contradiction. How does that work?
So when it comes to the Indian political tradition, I think it might sound apparently a dialectical interplay between two necessarily contradictory approaches, but I think that first of all, India embraces its spirit of India is essentially a melting pot, a cultural conundrum, and it has internalized the very notion of heterogeneity, of multicultural pluralism within its functionality of political process. And secularism, it's quite different from the Western notion of secularism. India follows the concept of secularism in not the sense that it is the separation of church from the religion. No, not in that sense. Secularism stands for the freedom of religious faith, freedom of tolerance, freedom of the freedom to propagate your religious thought. And I think that it has managed to accommodate different interests and different, mores and folkways and values and beliefs over the years. And it is a beautiful melting pot of different cultures, notwithstanding a history of invasions and colonization. So this is what makes India's robust participatory tradition so unique and so different. So I think it is not in a sense a contradiction. Theoretically, it might, but in a practical sense, it works perfectly, and it has stood the test of time. So yeah.
Liberal democracy tries to do is it tries to set a standard for this secular world, you know, and not the secularism that you're talking about in the Indian context, but what you said in the notion of Indian secularism tries to defeat is this idea that you can have a completely separated state-church dynamic, or whatever other religious institutions are held in that country. And that's, I mean, it's nearly impossible. Most people in any given society derive all of their moral and ethical compass from you know, the way that they are raised in a certain religious institution or that kind of thing. So it's at the heart of people anyway. There's no way that you would create a liberal democracy with some sort of beautiful, intense secularism unless all people within that state were to just magically become atheist overnight. So I don't know if any of the other speakers would like to jump in on that, perhaps, or no? That looks like a no. I'm searching for another question.
Learning, not speaking on that.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just checking the Q&A here. It looks like we've covered everything up to this point. I don't think I've missed anyone out, or I hope I haven't missed anyone out. And I think what we'll do is we'll take an extra 5 minutes break from the session, and then we come back at 11 o'clock for the second symposium on policies and party politics in South Africa, Ethiopia, and Uganda. And I just want to thank all of our speakers once again for a wonderful session, and may these great sessions at this conference continue. Well done to all of you, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Giovanni.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everybody for a wonderful session. And yes, we will reconvene at 11 o'clock with our second symposium. Please join us then.